I've been trying to put together a monograph about puppetry in cinema for quite some time. My interest in this came out of my studies of special effects, for which I had tried rather hubristically in retrospect to come up with a general theory of special effects, to find the connecting concepts between a diverse range of illusionistic practices. This, in the end, necessarily excluded, for the sake of space, if nothing else, quite a few things which might be termed special effects, which is an extraordinarily capacious term. It covers such a range of practices because of what they all do in servicing the illusionist needs of narrative cinema. But while things like compositing, matte painting, CGI, all have limited applications outside moving image media, puppetry is something that has its own heritage independent of the cinema. And what I was interested in is what happens when the two forms, puppetry and film, overlap. The puppet already has an ambiguous relationship with questions of presence, the body, and identity. Puppets arrive with their own preformed semiotic baggage simply by virtue of being non-living objects, commodities that are made to enact illusions of life. They tread a boundary between movement and stasis, vitality and mortality, and they trouble notions of such easily divisible binary categories. That is their public service, and they perform it automatically, regardless of what other drama or comedy they might be pantomiming at the time. And what I'm going to present today are sketches towards a projected chapter on ventriloquism. It doesn't yet have a book to fit into, nor a grand theoretical scheme. I haven't yet found a general theory of puppetivity. But ventriloquism is distinctive enough as a strand of puppetry that it demands special treatment to define its singular properties, and then to show A, how it is represented in cinema, and B, how cinema contributes to and mediates the ventriloquial act. The term ventriloquism has come to be used commonly in a metaphorical sense, as something akin to speaking on behalf of a subaltern. Charles B. Davis contends that ventriloquism is now almost a dead metaphor, absorbed into academic jargon as a general term for any variety of speaking for or through a represented other. The trope of ventriloquism, he continues, has come to stand for the postmodern mistrust of both mimetic and socio-political representation. Now, I want to resist extrapolating ventriloquism into this metaphorical territory and go back to looking at the craft itself. But nevertheless, I just want to briefly outline three ventriloquial metaphors that are pertinent to my discussion, even if they don't quite build into a methodological framework for the analysis of ventriloquist performance itself. And the first one, François Cooren, uses a ventriloquial metaphor in his attempts to define an aspect of communication studies. And he says that while traditional models of communication try to account for what communicants do and how they go about it, constitutive communication models focus on, and I quote, the effects by which people in interaction manage to act and speak for or in the name of specific beings to which they feel consciously or unconsciously attached, whether these beings be principles, values, beliefs, attitudes, ideas, ideologies, interests, organizations, etc. So, to summarize that, if I speak as a representative of an organization or espouse some piece of rhetoric that shores up the discourses of the social order, I am ventriloquizing that organization or those discourses by speaking on their behalf and bringing them into being. At the same time, they are ventriloquizing me by helping to constitute me as a speaking subject. So I am ventriloquized by the language structures that prescribe what I can and cannot say, and by the ideology that compels me to defend it and to articulate it to others. Similarly, David Goldblatt uses ventriloquism, or rather a set of ventriloquial relationships, as a way to conceptualize how we relate to works of art. Ventriloquism is, he says, a general condition of meaning that can be used to understand the act of interpretation. And he writes that interpretation is an attempt to say what the object of interpretation says, although in doing so we are talking to or with ourselves. So as viewers of a painting or a sculpture, we are put into a ventriloquial relationship with it, speaking on its behalf to re-articulate what it is trying to say. But in doing so, we're actually putting its communicative processes into our own words and inflecting it with our own selves. Hence Goldblatt's insinuation that while it appears we're having a dialogue with an object, we're really inventing a second voice for that object beside our own. At the same time, Goldblatt likens the artwork itself to a ventriloquist's dummy, since, and I quote, artworks gain a character that takes on independence from its makers and to an extent from the art world that gave it life. In the writing of drama, it's more apparent how a writer must speak in the voices of others by scripting the dialogue of fictional characters. But Goldblatt extends that analogy to how a painter might speak through an image. So that will be, in this discussion, one of the distinguishing features of ventriloquism, the semblance of an object being spoken for and appearing to speak for itself in a language that is not quite the artist's own. The third and final metaphor is Rick Altman's. He used ventriloquism, writing in 1980, as an expansive metaphor for the relationship between film, sound, and image. And he says, the soundtrack is a ventriloquist who, by moving his dummy, the image, in time with the words he secretly speaks, creates the illusion that the words are produced by the dummy image, whereas in fact the dummy image is actually created in order to disguise the source of the sound. Far from being subservient to the image, the soundtrack uses the illusion of subservience to serve its own ends. I think what Altman is saying here is in line with Michel Chion's notion of the audio-visual contract. And this is where viewers tacitly agree to accept that the sound they hear, which is actually coming from speakers in the auditorium, is emanating from the characters and settings within the diegesis. This is what Altman calls a myth of origins that masks the technological, mechanical, and thus industrial status of the cinema, and from the scandalous fact that sound films begin as language and not as pure image. Altman was trying to overturn the traditional dismissal of film sound as accompaniment to the image, but it's notable that he does so by drawing upon traditional and fictional characterization of the ventriloquial relationship as one of malevolence and mischief. He's also, if you look at this description, he's anthropomorphizing the soundtrack in order to put his theory across, suggesting that sound and the soundtrack is somehow maneuvering itself into position to manipulate the image for its own ends. So he argues that in cinema, speech takes the lead in most film drama, with the image following the speaker. So the over-the-shoulder shot reverse shot sequence is only the most obvious example of how dialogue might be seen to set the visual agenda and even dictate its tempo. So for Altman, the revelation of the ventriloquial nature of film sound is a return of the repressed, a return of language to prominence in cinema. Now, what is striking about these three metaphors is that they all rely on the reader's familiarity with ventriloquism, rather than talk directly about communication, about art, about cinema. Cooren, Goldblatt, and Altman have started speaking from a type of puppet performance which they presume readers will know and understand. This implies to me a sort of stock ventriloquial narrative, a strict set of conventions that are robust enough for these various references to it to remain stable and robust over time. So we think we know what ventriloquism is, even though it's a performance mode and should therefore be open to constant reinterpretation by its performers. But what it seems to support instead is extensive reiterations of the same central joke, the pretended confusion between puppet and puppeteer. And what I therefore find extraordinary is how, even in its most inane renditions, an act between a ventriloquist and dummy can dramatize such a range of metaphorical, theoretical positions simply by virtue of how it constructs a game with voices. So what is ventriloquism? First, it's worth pointing out that the term ventriloquism predates the use of dummies or talking figures, which is primarily entirely what I'm talking about today. John Hodgson reports that ventriloquism had to shed its roots as an ambiguous illusion where the source of the sound was uncertain and unattributed. Before 1800, he tells us, ventriloquism almost exclusively implied not a transferred but a disembodied voice, the voice putatively of a spirit, of a ghost, of God, or, once ventriloquism became a popular entertainment, of the performer's hidden or invisible companion. So what this refers to is the illusion of throwing voices. A performer might suggest that there's somebody in the next room just by manipulating depth cues to make their voice sound further away or muffled, for instance. And later on, when we get the dummy used as the primary form of ventriloquial entertainment, the puppet becomes the body that houses disembodied voices. For Stephen Connor, also, the ventriloquist and dummy act is the end point of a historical series of disassociated voices. Over the course of the 19th century, he says, ventriloquism developed from an itinerant, sometimes superstitious spatial illusion, where a performer would create the impression of disembodied noises coming from sources beyond his or her own body. It became a located performance, almost exclusively focused on a relationship between the performer and a puppet from which the secondary voice would seem to issue. And the rise of music hall assisted in this change, since one person with a dummy is much more portable as an act than large-scale stage sets that were often used in earlier theatrical performances. Music hall acts were turned over very rapidly, one after the other, so having a dummy as your only prop was, says Connor, a distinct advantage. Connor says that the unaccommodated polyphony of the early part of the century, the fascination of which lay in the control and construction of space, this is referring to throwing voices, gives way to the much more narrowly circumscribed conditions of the ventriloquist in dialogue with his twin or alter ego. Broadly, then, we may discern a move through the 19th century from the generalized repertoire of the polyphonist or virtuoso ventriloquist to a style of performance that's focused upon the vocal and psychological interplay between the ventriloquist and his dummy. This is a movement from extravagant diffuseness to increasing definition, i.e. the form of ventriloquial art becomes set in its ways throughout the 20th century, he suggests. Connor also shows how ventriloquial relationships became more culturally prevalent in, for example, the interplay between hypnotists and their subjects, psychoanalysts and their patients, spirit mediums and their own bodies, and all of the technologies such as the phonograph and the telephone that synthesized speech or mechanically abstracted it from its source. At the same time those developments were going on, ventriloquism became more of a visual form. And if ventriloquists used to create an auditory spectacle by creating a range of vocal caricatures, they would now bring their natural voice into dialogue with a puppet figure. So what do ventriloquists do? The main facets of a ventriloquial performance will very usually include some or all of the following. First, the ventriloquist directly manipulates a figure. They call it a figure. Most people call it a dummy. The vent, as they call themselves, and the dummy sit close, emphasizing the ontological contest between them. Ventriloquism is not quite like other forms of puppetry, where usually you would hide the operator to a greater or lesser degree. The audience is meant to see both puppeteer and puppet in peculiarly close proximity. As Charles B. Davis puts it, the self-reflexive framing and superimposed codes of human acting and puppetry can create a high degree of oscillation between the imitative, the meta-theatrical, and the material level of production. That is, the two are simultaneously present, and spectacle comes from the signification of their separateness through distinctions in their mannerisms and modes of speech, which is the next point. Distinction between two voices, indicated most often by difference in pitch, tone, register, and accent. More often than not, the dummy's voice is higher in pitch or nasal sounding, all of the tones which are easier to achieve without moving the lips. Because the next point is the ventriloquist's lips should not move visibly. The puppet may have degrees of articulation, usually an arm, but mostly in the face, blinking eyes, raising eyebrows, and most importantly, a movable jaw. It is not a necessary condition of the dummy, but they are almost always designed as caricatures and not as realistic figures. As Goldblatt reminds us, ventriloquism is illusion without deception. A truly deceived audience would undermine the nature of the act. And finally, the ventriloquist moves the puppet in order to suggest its animation, its autonomy. This can involve what we might term transiting focus from the face of the ventriloquist to the face of the puppet, a kind of misdirection where you move the puppet head more when your own face is still, to move the audience's gaze back and forth between puppet and performer. As Davis tells us, the visual signs that accomplish this misdirection include looking suddenly in another direction as if surprised by a sound, movement toward or away from the alleged source of a sound, and the facial and gestural signs that signify that the ventriloquist is straining to hear something. Now, it will help to see a demonstration, and I love showing this clip. This is a masterful bit of work from Ray Allen and Lord Charles, a piece of TV ventriloquism before we move on to cinema. If you don't remember Ray Allen and Lord Charles, you should immediately gauge what their relationship is, but Lord Charles is a kind of permanently drunk aristocrat, and in this skit he's revealed his own interest in becoming a ventriloquist.
Now here we go. Hello, Johnny. Hello, Governor. I'm good. Just excuse me. Just what is it? Just want to ask a question. Just now, when he said hello, Governor. No, that's me. I'm doing it. It's not him, you silly ass. It's ventriloquism.
Yeah.
I'm a ventriloquist.
Yes, that's fine, yes. But you said, you went like you sneered. You went like that. What did you do that for?
Well, I have to hold my mouth like that to do it. He can move his mouth, but I can't move mine. I'm a ventriloquist. I wish to goodness you'd just be quiet.
He said hello, Governor.
He said hello, Governor. I should know. I'm nearer to him than you are. Now he's going to do his joke.
Oh, I can't wait for that.
Now then, Johnny, how's your sister? In hospital. In the hospital? Piddle? I joke. What's wrong with her? She swallowed a 50 pence kiss. She swallowed a 50 pence piece, by Jove. And how is she now? No change? It's not the joke, it's the way he tells it.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm sorry, but I can't let this go. I mean, he said...
No, me doing it.
Sorry. You said hospital.
Yes?
I mean, yes, it's hospital.
Have you ever tried to say hospital without moving your mouth?
I can't say I'm bothered, no.
Well, no, go on.
What?
Go on, say hospital without moving your mouth.
Not now?
Yes, go on. Watch this. Well, go on.
Hospital.
Silly ass. I love these chaps who interfere and know damn all about it.
Okay, note that the jokes, in order to make sense, require the viewer, the listener, to keep track of various levels of vocalization. You have Alan, who is the instigator of the whole thing, who's pretending not to be a ventriloquist. And notice how he acts. He looks away. He pretends he's hearing this for the first time. So basically misdirecting you that he is not the source of the voice. You have Lord Charles, who's obviously voiced by Alan, pretending to be a ventriloquist. But we're also required to know that certain phonemes are very difficult to pronounce without moving the lips. So that when Lord Charles fails to pronounce them in his own ventriloquist act, but enunciates them perfectly when interviewed by Alan, we can appreciate the ventriloquist's expertise and enjoy his pretense of incompetence at the end. So that's the technical side of ventriloquism. The comedy of ventriloquial performance usually hinges on this kind of antagonistic relationship between dummy and voice, a bitter squabbling over ontological boundaries. The usual manifestation of this is in the unruly puppet who resists the master's instructions to behave, to remain silent or speak appropriately. Stephen Connor recognizes the duality of two voices in competition in the, and I quote, ever more clearly defined contrast between the neutral or educated language of the ventriloquist and the explosive, exorbitant, and often imperfect speech of the dummy. Often the characteristics of the figure's voice are determined by what the ventriloquist is capable of achieving without lip movements. So the voice is always constrained or twisted in some way. The very stiffness of their movements, says Connor, are a gestural enactment or substantiation of their imperfect articulation. So the antagonism that compounds the ventriloquial relationship is the verbal eruption of the divergences in their levels of authority, class, or education. What I've begun to describe here is what I term the ventriloquial narrative, a set of tropes that characterize and structure a ventriloquist's performance and which shapes the representation of ventriloquists in popular culture. The difference between puppet and puppeteer is the foundation of the ventriloquial narrative. We're invited to scrutinize the differences between them, to speculate upon the inner life of a puppet and how it reflects ultimately upon the identity of the ventriloquist. Now, I could divide ventriloquism movies into distinct zones, first being films in which ventriloquists appear as ventriloquists, and the subset of ventriloquist representations, the largest of which is horror films in which ventriloquists appear, often with possessed dummies, or rather, where there is an ambiguity over whether the puppet is alive or if the puppeteer is an insane split personality. As examples, in The Glass Eye, an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, a woman played by Jessica Tandy falls madly and unreasonably in love with Max Collodi, a ventriloquist. There's a Pinocchio reference in his name there, I think. And she follows him to all of his shows. When she finally gains an audience with him backstage, it's revealed that Collodi is actually the dummy, manipulated by a dwarf who's been dressing himself in a mask on stage every night. In The Ventriloquist's Dummy, an episode of the TV series Tales from the Crypt, a reclusive ventriloquist who's been linked to a series of murders is revealed to be, in actual fact, half of a conjoined twinning, his brother a monstrous outgrowth at the end of one arm. In Ealing's horror anthology Dead of Night, Michael Redgrave's ventriloquist comes to believe that his dummy is coming to kill him. He smashes it only to have its spirit take possession of his voice, though we could just as easily interpret the film as showing him going insane. In Richard Attenborough's Magic, Anthony Hopkins is similarly compelled to violence by a belief that his dummy is alive. But we can, again, read it either as the dummy speaking for itself, or it's Anthony Hopkins enunciating his own vicious self-loathing. Now, all of these horror films seem to me to be extruded from the uncanny and unsettling drama that always comes into play whenever a ventriloquist takes a dummy and makes it move and talk. All of these stories draw horror effects from the problem of attributing agency, sourcing voices, and they overbalance the ontological equilibrium that keeps actual ventriloquists locked in perpetual argument with their dummies. But I don't actually want to taxonomized ventriloquist movies in this way to separate out the horror stories from the comedy. All of these films, whether horrifying or comedic, are engaging with the same stuff of which ventriloquism is made. Having said that, there may be good reasons for the association between cinema and the unsettling nature of ventriloquial performance. Robert Spadoni, in his book Uncanny Bodies, suggests that the technical unease of the new Vitaphone process, which is a kind of sound on disc form of early film sound, where you would have the sound recorded on a large wax disc and the film projected separately, and you need considerable skill and luck to get them matched up, suggests that the technical unease of the new Vitaphone process, which often caused synchronization problems, required a period of adjustment on the part of viewers. And this is counter to the regular narrative which says that the talkies arrived, everyone went crazy for talkies. He suggests that the arrival of talking pictures made them medium sensitive, pushing audiences out of the state of illusion to which they were accustomed in the silent cinema, and it asked them to learn how to synthesize image and sound as a cognitive norm. And he tells us that every synchronization mishap served to remind viewers that the bodies speaking on the screen constituted whole entities only tenuously, ones that had been pieced together in a movie studio and that could come apart quite easily once inside the movie theatre. He lists all the ways in which sound was not a wondrous, longed-for revelation to viewers, but something that they had to learn to appreciate, something that broke the illusion they were used to. So Spadoni refers to a ventriloquism effect, a tendency amongst film critics to compare problems with film sound technology to a bad ventriloquist's act. And he suggests that early sound films have a distinctive ventriloquism effect because spectators were not yet used to it, were not yet making the instinctual connections between image and sound. And Mary Ann Doan, like Altman and Michel Chillon, has addressed the question of the unification of sound and image as part of classical cinema's project to mask its heterogeneity with the rhetoric and aesthetics of unity. So these are devices which hide the fact that the film has been assembled from various sources over a long period of time to give us an illusion of spatio-temporal continuity, that the scene is unfolding before us. And ventriloquism is always playing in the risky zone of mixing up an image, a sound, and the attribution of the sound's sources. I'm not quite ready to stake a definitive claim on this yet, but I suspect that the myth of the ventriloquist possessed by the spirit of a dummy is a product of the cinema, that it only emerges once we have films about ventriloquism, since that is where it provokes the most troubling undermining of the medium's own foundational certainties. In the meantime, I want to briefly refer to a few examples of how ventriloquism is represented, but also how it's enacted through the form of the films themselves. So, with The Unholy Three, here's an interesting example of a film made silent in 1925, and then remade with most of the same cast in 1930, in order to fit it into the new talkie market. In both versions, 3 sideshow performers are fired for misbehaviour, i.e. one of them attacks a child during a performance, and instead they form a criminal gang where they use a series of disguises to pull off some elaborate scams. Their leader, Echo the ventriloquist, played in both films by Lon Chaney, assumes the guise of Mrs. O'Grady, an old woman who runs a pet bird shop. So in the clip from the silent version, we have a lovely visual trick where the sound is located by words on the screen, as if they're issuing from a particular point in the diegetic space. So Echo, in his guise as Mrs. O'Grady, is going to try and convince this woman to buy particular parrots because they're good talkers. But of course, he's providing the voices of all of the birds. So you almost can't help filling in the sound for yourself as you're prompted by the image. It moves your gaze around the frame to suggest the throwing of the voice, the locating it in different positions. Just as the sound is supposed to be doing, thanks to Chaney's voice-throwing abilities, the eye is simulating the role of the ear in this clip. Now, in the sound version of the Unholy Three, the trick is one of audition, i.e. we get to see Chaney actually enunciating this same scene, but is it him providing the voices?
Mr. O'Grady. The lady out here wants to buy a parrot, and I can't make them talk. I look into it. You love babies, don't you? Yeah. Well.
Yeah, you and that guy. Oh. Yeah, you.
Pretty Polly. Pretty Polly. Pretty Polly. How do you do? Good morning. Now, well, I should like to practice a verb, but none of these speak. In your head, you old Lester. Oh. Why, did you hear what he said? Oh, I certainly did. You see, this is the nickname of Admiral Dewey. We just got him from Kentucky. Well, I wouldn't want such a rough-speaking bird. Mine is a Christian home. Oh, yes, of course, of course. Now, you see, this bird is much more refined. It is. See, but you don't refine me. Oh, why, isn't that a biblical quotation? Oh, yes. You see, this bird just belongs to any temple at Franklin. Oh. Rosie. What? Well, I was just going to say, it's wonderful the way your grandma can make those birds talk. Hector, she can make Kool-Aid talk.
It's tempting to point out that Lon Chaney was raised by deaf-mute parents, a fact which has occasionally been used by historians to account for his skill at pantomime. During the shooting of the 1930 version, he was suffering from bronchial lung cancer, and he died a few weeks after the film's release. He was celebrated in the silent period for his self-applied prosthetic makeups and bodily contortions that made a spectacle of the construction of grotesque characters. So when he came to make this, his first and only talkie, MGM circulated a document approved by lawyers to confirm that Chaney had produced all 5 voices attributed to his character. I'm not sure why they needed to do this, but it must have been good publicity for the film. Such may have been the mistrust or misinformation about early sound technology, that this was a logical method of authentication. And I'm not claiming that the talkies killed Lon Chaney. It's just an extraordinary coincidence that he died of cancer immediately after making his first talkie. Now, if, as Altman suggested, cinema is inherently ventriloquial, films about ventriloquists represent a double articulation of that principle, or possibly a reflection upon it. But the liveness of a ventriloquist's act is supposed to verify it as the authentic work of a human performer. So film has the problem of how to get around the fact that the voice is already artificially removed from the body by the separation of sound and image tracks. So why should we believe that this is Lon Chaney doing these voices when we know that cinema is a mechanism, or gives us an easy mechanism for simulating the ventriloquial act? We could easily add a different soundtrack. The next example is The Great Gabbo, which is a story about a stage ventriloquist played by Erich von Stroheim. He's driven mad by a lost love. It's also a timepiece about the strangeness of early sound film. So you'll hear in this clip the very kind of stilted, hesitating dialogue that you get in a lot of early sound films. This is an example of Stroheim's act within the film.
May I present to you Otto, the famous Otto, my other half.
Half? How you get like this? 3/4, you mean?
Otto, I think you are entirely too modest.
Well, I'm right.
I'm the act, not you. Everything depends on me.
Say, by the way, Otto, why were you late today?
I went to the dentist.
Does the tooth still hurt?
I don't know. He didn't give it back to me. Ha, ha, ha. How comical.
How is your little baby brother, Otto?
Oh, he makes me so mad. He cries and cries and cries.
You know, Otto, I think that child is absolutely spoiled.
Oh, no. They all smell that way.
Otto, little boys should be seen but not heard. You better keep quiet.
I will if you let me. A song written for me is special. I get by as long as I have you. Ooh, what a nice crack.
Otto, what nationality are you?
My nationality? Oh, we have a fine family tree. My mother, she comes from Cedar Hills. My father was a Pole, and I'm a chip from the old block. Marvelous. Should make screams of laughter or what have you.
Okay. The point here is that Stroheim is not ventriloquizing at all. The cinema is doing it all for him. So that's not really his voice. It's dubbed on separately or performed off screen. The cinema achieves the ventriloquial act on his behalf. Instead of allowing us to witness a virtuoso piece of human vocalization, the cinematic apparatus does the work. Stroheim plays a ventriloquist who loses his grip on reality and increasingly relies on the dummy as his means of self-expression. It can voice the things that he is too buttoned up and self-contained to say. And the film formalizes the distance between the two. It's quite a creepy, halting performance that they give, which may be a residue of discomfort with the new sound technology, but also kind of lends a little bit of menace to their interaction. Skipping ahead wantonly to Jodie Foster's The Beaver, a more recent film which combines the tropes of ventriloquism as metaphor and features a ventriloquist as split personality. It blends the drama of the misfit puppeteer using a puppet to project himself into society from behind a mask of personality and the trope of ventriloquial possession. So Mel Gibson plays Walter, who's become depressed and suicidal after the breakdown of his marriage. At rock bottom, he finds a beaver glove puppet in the refuse and begins to wear it constantly. And this puppet speaks for him in a kind of permanent ventriloquial show. Meanwhile, his socially withdrawn son is making money writing assignments for students at his high school, thanks to his ability to adopt their voices in his writing. So the drama's central metaphor of ventriloquial masks is rather blunt, to say the least. The mirrored central characters both speak through others and gain acceptance and financial success as a result, but can only find personal fulfillment after they find their own voices and learn how to communicate directly with each other. It's all a little bit trite, but what is interesting is how Walter's relationship with the beaver is formalized on film. So in this first clip, when he first begins to speak through the beaver in a kind of Michael Caine or Ray Winston voice for some reason, there's no attempt made to enforce the ventriloquial illusion. Gibson moves his lips freely. The camera invariably holds both him and the puppet together in the same shot, and the focus is pulled onto Gibson's face, subtly blurring the beaver's features. And through these simple, matter-of-fact techniques, director Jodie Foster ensures that we never suspect that the beaver has agency. This is always Walter speaking through a hand puppet. So you can see there that it's his face which is in focus. We're not formalizing the idea of the beaver speaking. However, towards the end of the film, Walter has failed to transition away from the beaver, who's become controlling and aggressive, i.e. Walter is back where he started, antisocial and impossible, only now he has a puppet stuck on his arm. He has a self-destructive breakdown which takes the form of a violent struggle with the beaver. And Foster signifies the puppet's increased hold over Walter by separating the two characters into their own shots and pulling focus onto the beaver. Gibson still moves his lips when speaking in the voice, but we're given reverse shots of the beaver, quote-unquote, speaking without Gibson's mouth visible, temporarily completing the circuit of the ventriloquial illusion by allowing the audio-visual connection between the image of the puppet and the sound of its voice provided by Gibson off camera. It's hard to talk over images of Mel Gibson beating up a puppet. In addition, the beaver's voice serves as the voiceover narration for the film at various points, which does toy with the idea that it might have some identity outside of its relationship with Walter. Turning 180 degrees into my final example, this is not a horrific but a classic example of the ventriloquial relationship. So I want to spend a little bit of time with Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen. Bergen had been a talented vaudeville ventriloquist, had appeared in a few Vitaphone short films, and then began appearing as the main artist on the radio show The Chase and Sanborn Hour from 1936, which later changed its name, reflecting their popularity, to the Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy Show. Bergen had several puppet characters in his repertoire, but the most successful of all was Charlie McCarthy, who was based on the appearance of a red-haired Irish-American newspaper boy Bergen had met in Chicago. McCarthy's personality crystallized into the figure of a 12-year-old schoolboy who is aware of his fame and status. He cares little for authority, hates school, also has an eye and a saucy line for the ladies. As its popularity grew, the radio show could attract major Hollywood stars. So there are episodes featuring routines with W.C. Fields, Humphrey Bogart, Bette Davis, Spencer Tracy, Orson Welles, Charles Lawton, Gregory Peck, Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland, Rita Hayworth, Marilyn Monroe, Hedy Lamarr, Claudette Colbert, Cecil B. DeMille, and many more. So here's a good example of one of their routines from a 1937 episode. And Bergen is lecturing McCarthy on the merits of education.
Play, that's all you think of. Yes, don't you ever think of the higher things? You mean tall girls? No. Oh, I'm still speaking of education. Oh, you are? Yes. Haven't the examples of Don and Dorothy, haven't they impressed you?
Well, you know, yes, they have. I bet you feel sorry that you didn't go, Mr.
Well, I want you to know that I studied at Northwestern Medical School.
You did?
Yes.
You mean the college for doctors and physicians?
No. Physicians.
Yes. Physicians? Physicians and surgeons, no.
Surgeons.
Yes. Surgeons and fishes.
No.
Yes. Forget it. All right. Well, say, why aren't you a doctor then?
Well, after 2 years of study, I felt that my talents ran along other lines.
Oh, I see. You flunked out, huh?
You think you're pretty cute, don't you?
Yeah.
But consider the years to come, young man.
Uh-huh.
What will you be 50 years from now?
62.
No.
After all, why should I learn a lot of stuff like Latin? I never intend to go there.
Go on. It isn't what you learn that's so important, Charlie. It's learning to think.
Oh, so that's it.
Yes. That's why you have mathematical problems such as if X plants 20 rows of potatoes, and at the end of each row he puts up a marker.
Oh, X marks the spot.
Yeah, no.
Well, who is X?
Well, X is hypothetical.
Oh, that is too bad. He shouldn't be working.
Well, but now remember, Y works twice as fast as X.
Well, he's feeling good.
Well, I don't.
Why don't you get rid of X?
Well, maybe we will. But why?
No, X.
All right. Now, let's take another problem. Let's,
Why don't you plant tapioca?
Well, tapioca wouldn't grow.
Well, then we wouldn't have to bother picking it.
All right. Suppose you have 3 cows. If the second cow gives twice as much milk as the first cow, and the third cow gives half as much milk as the first and the second cow give together, how much milk would you pick, or which cow would you pick?
Well, you didn't help that any, did you? I might go so far as to say that you ruined it all.
I'll hear more about this. You can't pin it on me? All right, all right.
Okay, note the way that Bergen keeps the back and forth chat between them moving quickly, with little yeses, ahums, and nos that fill in the gaps and suggest the pacing of two people conversing. Note also that when Bergen fluffs his line towards the end of the clip, McCarthy picks him up on it. And these moments where the act breaks down are not failures of speaking, but chances to authenticate the illusion by injecting some spontaneity into it, letting the puppet step out of the routine as if he really is part of a double act. Now, ventriloquism on the radio might sound like a strange idea at first, but only if you consider ventriloquism to be a predominantly visual form. It's also a feat of spectacular vocalization. Radio shifts the emphasis onto the skillful dynamic between two voices coming from a single source. Listeners were expected to know, however, that it was a ventriloquist act and not two actors speaking to each other. There's lots of jokes that depend on it for a start. In one of them, Bergen tells Charlie money doesn't grow on trees, and Charlie replies, well, yours did, which is a reference to the fortune that Bergen has made using McCarthy, but also to the fact that McCarthy is wooden. You also see them in a lot of publicity, where they're pictured together. So it's not as if they would have been hidden from show. People would be familiar with what they looked at. So there's no intention to deceive and suggest that this is two separate voices. To get the joke, you have to know that this is a ventriloquist act. They also made many public appearances, appeared in advertisements, magazine features, and movie roles. And the pair's relationship is built around paradoxes that would be frightening if we were invited to consider them anything more than a comic frame. Charlie regularly keeps secrets from Bergen, acts independently, says what the puppeteer is too polite, reserved, or clueless to say. Now, Charlie flirts with almost every female guest on the show. In one episode, he's engaged to Marilyn Monroe, and in another, from December 1937, he reveals a tryst with Mae West. And the innuendos in that sequence saw her being banned from all NBC stations, including mention of her name was not allowed on NBC. And she didn't appear on radio again until 1950. And I won't read this out because you should never read out Mae West dialogue, but there are jokes such as, you're all wood and a yard long. I've got marks to prove you kissed me and splinters too. I'll let you play in my wood pile. Again, these are jokes which rely on knowledge that this is a puppet, but also it might be horrifying to be listening to an older woman seducing a 12-year-old schoolboy, unless we know that it's just a puppet. So McCarthy stays a child while Bergen ages, which leads to references in jokes about Bergen's progressive hair loss. Now, Charlie is in Bergen's care, but we have no backstory on whether Bergen is meant to be his adoptive father, or, alternatively, how the bachelor came to have a child living with him. Instead, the ventriloquial narrative fills in that backstory, and we cannot make sense of their relationship without it. The running joke is that Charlie resists Bergen's authority, misbehaves at school, and seeks a raise in his allowance. So the joke there is that Charlie is out of control, when in reality he is entirely under Bergen's control. He's his puppet. And that Bergen makes a fortune from Charlie but doesn't share the wealth. All of these are jokes that are part of the ventriloquial narrative that binds them and makes sense of them. It structures the act's play with language, with duality, and with the definitions of their relationship, just as it incorporates and structures every other ventriloquial performance. And one of the most extensive biographical studies of Bergen comes in the first section of his daughter Candice's autobiography, Knock Wood. And the paradigm of ventriloquism helps her to analyse her relationship with her father. She invokes an impression of the ventriloquist who is distinct in personality from his dummy, and whose dummy says the things he never could. That motif is such a staple of many acts. And here's how she describes him. Awkward, silent, socially unsuccessful, Edgar created someone who caught people's fancies when he most often could not. Gradually, He began leaving things to this dummy, so saucy, witty, self-assured, and learned to let him take over while behind his left shoulder, bashful, sort of beautiful, stood Edgar, as if by accident, listening in amusement while Charlie just wowed him. This is a description of the Bergen and McCarthy dynamic, but it's also contributing to the mythos of the ventriloquist by affirming in language the charade that the two are separate, as if Bergen could stand by and listen. So this is another component of the ventriloquial narrative, the running joke that runs through every act. By discussing McCarthy in these personifying terms, she plays a role in bringing him to life, contributing to the incarnating discourse that surrounds the puppet. Now, the media played along with this process and also helped to construct that ventriloquial narrative that extends beyond the borders of any particular performance or film. So the Bergen and McCarthy relationship was happily subjected to speculation, some of which goes beyond playing along and publicizing the act towards psychological realism. This from the New York Herald Tribune in 1939. On the one hand, there is a gay, irrepressible Charlie, through whom, by some strange alchemy, the shy and pallid Bergen is transformed into a brilliant comedian. On the other hand, there's an imperious and dominating Charlie, whose almost human personality has so eclipsed his creator that Bergen cannot function as an artist alone. Charlie is famous, says Bergen glumly, and I am the forgotten man. I'm really jealous of the way Charlie makes friends, Bergen complains wistfully. People are at ease with Charlie. He's so uncomplicated. Is Bergen in character in that moment where he says that he's jealous of Charlie? Well, ventriloquism encourages this kind of slippage between character and actor. And this is how Candice Bergen's birth was announced in Variety magazine, 10th of May 1946. Wooden-bodied Charlie McCarthy, the redwood half of the famed radio team, today had a flesh-and-blood rival for the affections of Edgar Bergen since the arrival of a 7-pound, 13.5-ounce daughter last night at Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. Mrs. Bergen, who was married to Charlie's stooge last June, was reported doing well. So it is through the ventriloquial paradigm that Candice Bergen can characterize her father as paradoxically diffident, reserved with his affection, comparing his treatment of Charlie as a star and describing herself as Charlie's sister. The press fabricated this rivalry between Candice and Charlie, just as they postulated a false dichotomy between Charlie and Edgar, and she in turn uses it as a rhetorical peg on which to hang her ruminations about her father's mind. Not a particularly patient man, she says, he was intolerant and short-tempered with slowness or stupidity. My father was, of course, famous for one-man dialogues, for snappy comebacks to his own questions, the soloist of repartee. His impatience with answers that were long in coming seemed perfectly reasonable, considering he made his living by giving his own. And later on, when she becomes a guest on the Bergen and McCarthy radio show, she can draw upon this narrative to describe herself. And she says, I recited my well-learned lines with considerable poise and polish, a perfect little ham, a wind-up doll, a dummy, a daughter determined to make good. If radio offers a variation on the ventriloquial paradigm, then cinema throws in its own iterations and twists. I want to finish by showing short clips from the Bergen and McCarthy sequences from the movie Here We Go Again from 1942. Now, this is a farcical episodic comedy from starring a number of radio personalities. Now, tellingly, a lot of the jokes are about voice, about misunderstandings, mishearings, speech impediments. And in all of their scenes here, there's some trick to get Charlie separate from Bergen, to play this game with the usual part of the act where they are seated together at all times. So the cinematic apparatus makes this possible for us to see Charlie and Bergen separate.
we going now?
To the Silvertip Lodge.
Oh. After we check in, we look over the situation, huh?
What do you mean?
Yeah, a little dancing and stuff like that.
We're not checking in.
No?
No, we're merely stopping at the lodge to arrange for our camp.
Oh, we're camping out.
That's right.
Lucky for you, you got a Boy Scout with you.
Oh, can you build a campfire?
Sure. Last summer, I was supposed to light a campfire and not use more than 2 matches. And only use one.
Only 1 match. And you lit the campfire?
I burned a whole darn camp down.
You did.
What are you trying to do? Play badminton with a butterfly? Oh, hey, remember the trees have the right of way. Oh, enough is enough, Bergen. All the Sunday drivers. Oh, for goodness sake, if you don't get back on the road, I'll clip you, say help me, I'll mow you down. Oh, my goodness. Chasing butterflies. What I wouldn't give for a little excitement, boy. I would... Whoa, whoa, hey! Hey, Bergen! Come here! Hey, Bergen! Tinder! Tinder! Whoa! Doesn't look like I'm gonna start it like under an accident. Wait! How do I signal for a left-hand smash-up? Goody. Bergen caught a tree. Save me the drumstick. Tonight, oh, we're tenting tonight, tenting on the cold damp ground. Hello, Bergen.
Now, you go to sleep, Charlie. I'm going to get to water for the morning.
Tenting on the cold damp ground, the dirty ground. Bergen! Is that you, Bergen? It is. Your voice is changing. Uh-oh. Could it be he's been nipping at the bottle? Oh, well, I'll pretend I'm asleep. I won't bother. Puffing like an old bear, Bergen. So you went to get water, huh, Bergen? You hung one out in a hurry. Want me to get you to bicarb? Say, there aren't any bear around here, are there, Bergen? Well, that's nice to know. You know what I'd do if I ran into there? Well, I'd wrestle him. Well, I'd grapple that grizzly. I'd beat him into a fur rug. I'd just ruin a bruin. What do you think of that, Bergen? What's the matter? Can't you talk? Bergen?
Now, go to sleep, Charlie. I'm right outside.
Yeah. You are where?
I'm right outside.
Yeah. Who are you trying to kid? You and your ventriloquism. I'm right outside. You know, I'm glad you brought me up here, Bergen. Oh, you sentimental old fool, you. You know.
Now, what's the matter? Whoa! Charlie, come on, get out of there.
Get him, Bergen, get him. They're off to a fast start. They're out around the turn. Bergen in the lead. Bruin a close second. They're coming down the stretch. They're on the outside. Will Bergen end up on the inside? Come on, Bergen.
Hand me my gun, Charlie.
Put salt on his tail. He went that way.
Have you got it, Charlie?
Here you are, Bergen. I wish you could be here, folks. It's really a great race. We're soon near the finish. That's it. Well, there's steak tomorrow. Well, now for a little shut-eye. Bergen?
Girls, there's Charlie McCarthy.
What a bevy of doves. Oh, the game warden.
What are you doing? Oh, I beg your pardon.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
I'm Edgar Bergen. This is...
Yes, I know. That's Charlie McCarthy. I'm Jean Gildersleeve.
Oh, how do you do, Miss Gildersleeve?
How do you do? This is my senior division of the Girl Guides of Ironton.
Hello,
how do you do?
How do you do, division?
Is that your camp?
Yes, we're sort of roughing it.
Roughing it? You seem to have everything but a butler.
His idea of roughing it is to sleep in the tops of his pajamas.
Do you mind if I look around?
No, not at all.
What part of heaven did you little angels fall from?
We're studying nature's wonders.
What did you say?
We're Girl Guides.
Is that so? Who are you, the droop of the troop?
Mr. McCarthy, are you a Boy Scout?
Oh, yes, indeed. I'm the Wolf Patrol.
Don't worry, they won't hurt him.
Oh, I'm not worried about him.
Oh, take it easy, girls. I'll last longer.
What's the matter, Charlie? Don't you like girls?
Well, of course I do. But I fluster when you cluster.
What's going on here, Charlie?
Go away, Bergen. You've got the soul of a house detective.
We'll take care of Charlie, Mr. Bergen.
Yes, please, Mr. Bergen.
But, Charlie, we're here on a scientific expedition.
There goes a moth, Bergen.
That looks like a Bombex Morai. Excuse me, I see one.
Don't let the moth corner you. Watch your backhand, Bergen. He's as graceful as a gazelle with arthritis. Don't get too close. He might kick.
Oh, Edgar, I was afraid you'd be killed.
Would you really have cared?
Oh, darling, of course I would.
Wow. Anybody want to adopt an orphan?
Okay, it's not Tarkovsky, I'll give you that, but it'll do for now. So in all of their scenes in this film, Bergen and McCarthy get separated. There's even that reverse ventriloquism scene when they encounter the bear. In several shots, McCarthy is played by a small boy in a mask, which is rather a jarring effect. But the cinematic apparatus facilitates these transgressions of the ventriloquial rules that allow the separation of the two. It's worth noting, though, that the voices never overlap. Even though Bergen could have performed McCarthy separately from his own scenes, for most of the time he's provided both voices on the same soundtrack. There's a couple of shots where he hasn't done that. So in these clips you'll see most variations on how a ventriloquial act can be mediated on film. As the pair are split up spatially, the film does not sever the ventriloquial ties that bind them. The jokes are still about ventriloquism, commentating on the relationship between image and sound. So Charlie, for instance, narrates Bergen's fight with a bear and jokes about Bergen's voice throwing. So Bergen overdubs some of the performance in the bear scene to authenticate the rather jarring appearance of a boy in a mask by lending him Charlie's voice. Now I need to do some kind of final summary here, and I'd suggest that whatever the ventriloquist is doing on screen, the performance is plugged into a discursive network of the ventriloquial narrative, an intertextual framework that transcends any individual act. It prompts reflection upon the relationship between image and sound, between space and the body, not through deconstructive textual reinterpretations of film form, so much as through play and a self-reflexive focus on sound and the sources of sound. And I've spoken for exactly an hour, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.